Welcome back to the banks of the ancient Nile, where the gentle murmur of flowing water and the soft rustle of papyrus in the evening breeze create the perfect atmosphere for tonight's peaceful journey into the past. I'm your guide through the sands of time, and tonight we'll explore the rich and fascinating world of food in ancient Egypt, a civilization that transformed the simple act of eating into an art form that nourished both body and soul. As you settle into your comfortable position, imagine the warm glow of oil lamps flickering in an ancient Egyptian kitchen, where the air is filled with the enticing aromas of freshly baked bread, roasted meat, and exotic spices. The soft sounds of grinding grain and bubbling stews provide a soothing backdrop as we step back over 3 millennia to discover how the people of the pharaohs fed themselves and their gods. Tonight's exploration will take us from the humble grain fields along the Nile to the elaborate banquet halls of the pharaohs, from the simple meals of farmers and craftsmen to the complex culinary rituals that connected the earthly and divine realms. Close your eyes and let the ancient world unfold around you as we discover the timeless human relationship with food that sustained one of history's greatest civilizations. In ancient Egypt, bread was far more than mere sustenance. It was the foundation of life itself, so central to existence that the hieroglyphic symbol for bread also meant life. The Egyptians understood that their civilization depended entirely on their ability to grow, process, and transform grain into the bread that fed everyone from the humblest farmer to the mightiest pharaoh. The story of Egyptian bread begins with the annual miracle of the Nile's flood, which deposited rich, fertile silt across the river's floodplains. This natural fertilizer created ideal conditions for growing the grains that would sustain Egyptian civilization for over 3,000 years. The 2 primary grains were emar, wheat, and barley, both of which were well adapted to the Egyptian climate and soil conditions. Emar wheat was the preferred grain for making bread, producing a flour that could be baked into loaves with good texture and flavor. This ancient variety of wheat was hardier than modern wheat, but required more processing to remove the tough hulls that protected the grain kernels. The extra effort was worthwhile because emmer wheat produced bread that was both nutritious and satisfying. Barley was equally important, but was used primarily for making beer rather than bread. However, barley bread was also common, particularly among the working classes who found it filling and economical. Barley grew well in the Egyptian climate and was often the first crop to be harvested each year, providing early sustenance after the long months of waiting for the new harvest. The cultivation of grain was a community effort that involved entire villages working together during the critical planting and harvesting seasons. The timing had to be perfect too early, and the grain would not be mature enough too late, and it might be damaged by changing weather conditions or pests. The harvest season was a time of intense activity and celebration, as entire communities worked from dawn to dusk to gather the precious grain that would sustain them through the coming year. Men wielded sickles to cut the grain stalks, while women and children gathered the cut grain into bundles that could be transported to threshing areas. Threshing was accomplished by having cattle or donkeys trample the grain to separate the kernels from the stalks. This process required careful timing and technique to ensure that the grain was properly separated without being damaged. The threshed grain was then winnowed by tossing it into the air on windy days, allowing the lighter chaff to blow away while the heavier grain kernels fell back to the ground. Once cleaned, the grain was stored in large granaries that protected it from moisture, pests, and theft. These storage facilities were among the most important buildings in any Egyptian community, as they contained the wealth that would sustain the population through the year. The granaries were carefully designed with thick walls and small openings that could be sealed to prevent contamination. The transformation of grain into bread was a daily ritual that began before dawn in households throughout Egypt. The process started with grinding the grain into flour using stone corns, 2 circular stones that were rubbed together to crush the grain between them. This was hard, time-consuming work that was typically performed by women who had developed the strength and technique needed to produce fine, even flour. The quality of the flour depended on how finely it was ground and how thoroughly the bran and other impurities were removed. The finest white flour was reserved for the wealthy and for religious offerings, while coarser, darker flours were used for everyday bread consumed by ordinary people. Even the coarsest bread was nutritious and filling, providing the energy needed for the demanding physical labor that characterized Egyptian life. The actual bread-making process began with mixing the flour with water to create a dough. Egyptian bakers had discovered that allowing the dough to ferment naturally would produce lighter, more digestible bread. Wild yeasts in the air would colonize the dough and begin the fermentation process that would make the bread rise and develop its characteristic flavor. The fermentation process was carefully controlled by experienced bakers who understood how temperature, humidity, and timing affected the final product. The dough was kneaded thoroughly to develop the gluten that would give the bread its structure, then shaped into loaves of various sizes and forms, depending on their intended use. The shaped loaves were then left to rise in a warm, humid environment that encouraged the yeast to ferment and produce the gases that would make the bread light and airy. The timing of this process was crucial, as under-fermented bread would be dense and heavy, while over-fermented bread would collapse and become sour. Baking was performed in clay ovens that were heated with wood or dried dung. These ovens had to be carefully managed to maintain the right temperature throughout the baking process. The bakers would test the oven's heat by throwing flour into it and watching how quickly it browned, adjusting the fire as needed to achieve the perfect baking conditions. Different types of bread required different baking techniques. Some breads were baked directly on the oven floor, while others were placed in clay pots or molds that gave them specific shapes. The most elaborate breads were decorated with seeds, nuts, or other ingredients that added flavor and visual appeal. The finished bread varied enormously in quality and appearance depending on the ingredients used and the skill of the baker. The finest breads, made from white flour and enriched with eggs, milk, or honey, were reserved for the wealthy and for religious offerings. Common people ate darker, coarser breads that were nonetheless nutritious and filling. Bread played a crucial role in Egyptian religion and mythology. The god Osiris was closely associated with grain and bread, and his death and resurrection were seen as symbolic of the annual cycle of planting, harvest, and renewal. Bread was offered to the gods in temples and was believed to sustain the deceased in the afterlife. The economic importance of bread in Egyptian society led to strict government regulation of its production and distribution. Bakers were licensed and monitored to ensure that they maintained proper standards and didn't cheat their customers. The punishment for selling underweight or adulterated bread could be severe, including fines, imprisonment, or even physical punishment. The fertile banks of the Nile River provided ancient Egyptians with an abundance of fresh fruits and vegetables that formed an essential part of their diet. The annual flooding of the river deposited rich, black soil across the floodplains, creating ideal growing conditions for a wide variety of crops that sustained the population throughout the year. The Egyptian agricultural calendar was intimately connected to the Nile's flood cycle, which divided the year into 3 distinct seasons. The inundation season, when the river flooded its banks, was followed by the growing season, when crops were planted and tended, and finally, the harvest season, when the mature crops were gathered and stored. During the growing season, Egyptian farmers cultivated extensive gardens and orchards that produced a remarkable variety of fruits and vegetables. These agricultural areas were carefully planned and maintained, with sophisticated irrigation systems that channeled water from the Nile to ensure that crops received adequate moisture throughout the growing period. Onions were among the most important vegetables in the Egyptian diet, valued not only for their flavor, but also for their keeping qualities and nutritional benefits. Egyptian onions were particularly prized for their size and sweetness, and they were eaten both raw and cooked in a variety of dishes. The workers who built the pyramids were said to have consumed enormous quantities of onions, which were believed to give them strength and protect them from disease. The cultivation of onions required careful attention to soil preparation and irrigation. The seeds were planted in carefully prepared beds and tended throughout the growing season. The bulbs were harvested when they reached maturity and were then dried and stored for use throughout the year. The keeping qualities of onions made them particularly valuable during the months when fresh vegetables were scarce. Garlic was another essential crop that was both a food and a medicine. The Egyptians understood that garlic had powerful antibacterial properties, and they used it to treat a variety of ailments as well as to flavor their food. Garlic was so highly valued that it was sometimes used as currency, and workers were often paid partly in garlic rations. The growing of garlic required similar techniques to onions, but with different timing and care. Garlic cloves were planted in the fall and harvested the following summer, when the leaves began to yellow and die back. The harvested garlic was braided into long strings that could be hung in dry, well-ventilated areas for storage. Leeks were cultivated extensively and were particularly popular among the wealthy, who appreciated their mild flavor and versatility in cooking. Egyptian leeks were larger and more tender than their wild ancestors, the result of centuries of careful cultivation and selection. They were often served at banquets and were considered a delicacy worthy of the finest tables. The cultivation of leeks required rich, well-watered soil and careful attention throughout the growing season. The plants were often earthed up as they grew to produce the long white stems that were prized for their tender texture and mild flavor. Leeks could be harvested throughout much of the year, providing a reliable source of fresh vegetables. Lettuce was grown in Egyptian gardens and was associated with the god Min, who was believed to promote fertility and abundance. Egyptian lettuce was quite different from modern varieties, with longer, more bitter leaves that were often eaten raw or lightly cooked. The plant was valued not only as food, but also for its supposed aphrodisiac properties. The growing of lettuce required careful attention to watering and protection from the intense Egyptian sun. The plants were often grown in partially shaded areas or were protected with reed mats during the hottest parts of the day. Multiple plantings throughout the year ensured a continuous supply of fresh lettuce leaves. Cucumbers thrived in the Egyptian climate and were eaten fresh or pickled for preservation. The cooling properties of cucumbers made them particularly popular during the hot summer months, and they were often served at meals to help diners cope with the intense heat. Egyptian cucumbers were smaller and more bitter than modern varieties, but were nonetheless refreshing and nutritious. The cultivation of cucumbers required abundant water and rich soil. The vines were often trained on supports to keep the fruit off the ground and to make harvesting easier. The cucumbers were picked when young and tender, as older fruits became tough and bitter. The fruit trees that grew in Egyptian orchards provided a sweet contrast to the savory vegetables that formed the bulk of the diet. Date palms were perhaps the most important fruit trees, as they produced not only delicious dates, but also palm wine, palm oil, and building materials from their trunks and leaves. Egyptian dates were renowned throughout the ancient world for their size, sweetness, and keeping qualities. The trees were carefully tended, with farmers climbing high into the canopy to pollinate the female flowers by hand and to harvest the ripe fruit. This was dangerous work that required considerable skill and courage, as the trees could grow to heights of over 60 feet. The harvesting of dates was a community effort that took place over several weeks as different varieties ripened at different times. The fresh dates were eaten immediately or dried for storage. Dried dates could be kept for months without spoiling and provided a concentrated source of energy and nutrients throughout the year. Figs were another crucial fruit crop that grew well in the Egyptian climate. The trees produced 2 crops per year, providing fresh fruit during different seasons and extending the availability of this nutritious food. The first crop ripened in early summer, while the second crop was ready in late fall. Fresh figs were highly perishable and had to be eaten quickly after harvest. However, they could be dried to extend their shelf life, and dried figs became an important trade commodity. The trees themselves were valuable for their wood and leaves, which had various uses in Egyptian society. Grapes were cultivated in vineyards along the Nile and in the Delta region, where the climate was particularly suitable for viticulture. Egyptian grapes were used to make wine, which was consumed by the wealthy and used in religious ceremonies. The grapes were also eaten fresh and dried into raisins, which could be stored for long periods without spoiling. The cultivation of grapes required specialized knowledge and techniques that were passed down through generations of vintners. The vines had to be carefully pruned and trained to produce the best fruit, and the timing of the harvest was crucial. For producing high-quality wine, pomegranates were prized for their beautiful appearance and complex flavor, as well as for their symbolic significance in Egyptian religion. The fruit was associated with fertility and eternal life, and pomegranate motifs appeared frequently in Egyptian art and architecture. The seeds were eaten fresh or used to make refreshing drinks. The growing of pomegranates required patience, as the trees took several years to begin producing fruit. However, once established, the trees were long-lived and productive. The fruit was harvested in the fall and could be stored for several months if kept in cool, dry conditions. Melons and watermelons grew abundantly in Egyptian fields and provided refreshing relief from the desert heat. These fruits were particularly important during the hot summer months when other fresh foods were scarce. The high water content of melons made them valuable for maintaining hydration, while their natural sugars provided quick energy. The cultivation of melons required careful attention to watering and soil preparation. The vines were often grown in specially prepared beds that retained moisture and provided good drainage. The fruit was harvested when fully ripe and was consumed immediately, as it did not keep well in the hot climate. The protein sources available to ancient Egyptians were as diverse as they were abundant, ranging from the fish that swam in the Nile's waters to the cattle that grazed in the river's fertile pastures. The availability and consumption of these protein sources varied greatly depending on social status, geographic location, and religious considerations that governed Egyptian dietary practices. Fish formed the foundation of protein consumption. For most Egyptians, particularly those of modest means who could not afford meat on a regular basis, the Nile River and its associated canals, marshes, and lakes teemed with dozens of species of fish that could be caught using a variety of traditional methods that had been perfected over centuries. The most common fishing technique involved the use of nets made from papyrus fibers or flax. These nets were carefully woven to create different mesh sizes appropriate for catching different types of fish. Large nets required teams of fishermen working together to deploy and retrieve them, while smaller nets could be handled by individual fishermen working from small boats or from the riverbank. The construction of fishing nets was a specialized craft that required considerable skill and knowledge. The fibers had to be prepared properly to ensure that they were strong and durable, and the weaving had to be done with precise tension to create nets that would hold together under the stress of catching fish. Different types of nets were designed for different fishing situations and fish species. Fishing with hooks and lines was also common, particularly for catching larger fish that might escape through net meshes. Egyptian fishhooks were made from bronze or bone and were surprisingly sophisticated in their design. Different hook shapes and sizes were used for different species of fish, and experienced fishermen knew exactly which type of hook to use in different situations. The making of fishhooks required considerable skill in metalworking or bone carving. Bronze hooks were forged by skilled craftsmen who understood how to shape the metal to create hooks that were both strong and sharp. Bone hooks were carved from the bones of large animals and were often just as effective as their metal counterparts. Spearfishing was practiced in shallow waters where fish could be seen clearly. This method required considerable skill and patience, as the fishermen had to account for the refraction of light in water that made fish appear to be in different positions than they actually were. Successful spear fishermen were highly respected for their accuracy and timing. The spears used for fishing were typically made from wood with sharp points of bone or metal. Some spears had multiple points to increase the chances of hitting the target, while others had barbed points that would prevent the fish from escaping once speared. The technique required years of practice to master. The most abundant fish in the Nile were various species of catfish, which were prized for their size and flavor. These fish could grow quite large and provided substantial amounts of protein for Egyptian families. Catfish were often caught during the flood season when they moved into shallow areas to spawn, making them easier to catch in large numbers. The preparation of catfish required careful attention to removing the tough skin and cleaning the fish properly. The meat was often cut into steaks or fillets that could be cooked in various ways. The bones and other parts of the fish were not wasted but were used to make soup stock or were dried and ground into meal for animal feed. Perch were another important fish species that were caught throughout the year. These smaller fish were often dried and salted for preservation, allowing families to maintain a supply of protein even when fresh fish were not available. Dried perch could be stored for months without spoiling and were often ground into powder to add protein to other dishes. The drying and salting of fish was a crucial preservation technique that allowed Egyptians to maintain protein supplies throughout the year. The fish were cleaned and gutted, then covered with salt and left to cure for several days. After curing, they were hung in the sun to dry completely, creating a preserved product that could last for months without refrigeration. Cattle were the most prestigious source of meat in ancient Egypt, but they were expensive to raise and maintain, making beef a luxury that was primarily available to the wealthy. Egyptian cattle were smaller than modern breeds, but were to the local climate and conditions along the Nile. The raising of cattle required substantial resources, including pasture land, water, and feed during the dry season when natural forage was scarce. Wealthy landowners maintained herds of cattle, both for their meat and for their milk, which was used to make cheese and other dairy products. The cattle were often kept in enclosed areas near the Nile, where they could be easily watered and protected from predators. The care of cattle required specialized knowledge and skills that were passed down through generations of herdsmen. The animals had to be protected from disease, provided with adequate nutrition, and managed during breeding season to ensure healthy offspring. The most valuable cattle were often given names and were treated almost like members of the family. The slaughter of cattle was often a ceremonial occasion, particularly when the meat was intended for religious offerings or important celebrations. The process was carefully regulated to ensure that the meat was properly prepared and that nothing was wasted. Every part of the animal was used, from the meat and organs to the hide and bones. The butchering of cattle required considerable skill to ensure that the meat was properly cut and prepared. Different cuts were used for different purposes, with the finest cuts reserved for the most important occasions. The organs were often considered delicacies and were prepared in special ways that enhanced their flavor and nutritional value. Goats and sheep were more commonly raised by ordinary Egyptians because they required less resources and could survive on marginal land that was not suitable for cattle. These animals provided not only meat but also milk, wool, and hides that were essential for daily life. The herding of goats and sheep was often done by children and young adults who would take the animals to graze in areas where they would not interfere with crop production. The animals were hardy and could survive on vegetation that was not suitable for human consumption, making them efficient converters of marginal resources into valuable protein. Pork was consumed by some Egyptians, particularly those in lower social classes, but it was considered unclean by many and was forbidden in certain religious contexts. Pigs were efficient converters of food scraps into protein, making them valuable. For families who could not afford to raise larger animals, the raising of pigs was often done in urban areas, where they could be fed on kitchen scraps and other waste materials. This made them valuable for waste disposal, as well as protein production. However, the religious taboos associated with pork meant that it was never served at formal occasions or offered to the gods. Poultry was an important source of protein that was accessible to people of all social classes. Ducks and geese were particularly common, as they thrived in the marshy areas along the Nile and could be raised with minimal resources. These birds provided both meat and eggs, making them valuable additions to Egyptian households. The raising of ducks and geese required access to water and suitable nesting areas. The birds were often allowed to forage freely during the day and were penned at night for protection from predators. The eggs were collected regularly and were used both for eating and for hatching new birds. The hunting of wild birds was a popular activity among the wealthy, who used trained hunting birds and elaborate nets to catch waterfowl in the Nile's marshes. This activity was as much about sport and social status as it was about obtaining food, and scenes of bird hunting were commonly depicted in tomb paintings and reliefs. The techniques used for hunting wild birds were sophisticated and required considerable skill and knowledge. Hunters had to understand the behavior and migration patterns of different bird species, and they had to be able to set traps and nets in the right places at the right times to be successful. In ancient Egypt, beverages were far more than simple thirst quenchers. They were essential elements of daily nutrition, religious practice, and social interaction. Beer and wine held special places in Egyptian society, serving as currency, offerings to the gods, and symbols of civilization itself. Beer was the most important beverage in ancient Egypt, consumed daily by people of all ages and social classes. Unlike modern beer, Egyptian beer was thick, nutritious, and often served as a meal replacement, rather than simply a recreational drink. The brewing process was so fundamental to Egyptian life that it was considered a sacred art overseen by the goddess Tenenet. The production of beer began with the same grains used for bread making: emmer, wheat, and barley. However, the preparation process was quite different and required specialized knowledge and equipment. The grain was first partially germinated by soaking it in water and allowing it to sprout, a process that converted the starches into fermentable sugars. After germination, the grain was dried and ground into a coarse meal that retained more of the grain's nutrients than the fine flour used for bread. This meal was then mixed with water to create a thick porridge that was partially baked into bread-like loaves. These loaves were not meant to be eaten, but served as a concentrated source of fermentable material for the brewing process. The brewing process itself took place in large ceramic vats, where the bread loaves were broken up and mixed with water to create a thick, soupy mixture. This mixture was then allowed to ferment naturally, with wild yeasts in the air beginning. The process that would transform the grain, sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. The fermentation process was carefully monitored by experienced brewers who understood how temperature, timing and ingredients affected the final product. The mixture was stirred regularly to ensure even fermentation and to prevent the development of off flavors that could ruin the entire batch. Different types of beer were produced by varying the ingredients and brewing techniques. Some beers were made primarily from barley, while others used wheat or a mixture of grains. Honey, dates, or other sweeteners might be added to create different flavors and alcohol levels. Spices and herbs were sometimes used to add complexity and to help preserve the beer. The finished beer was thick and cloudy, with a consistency more like a thin porridge than modern beer. It was highly nutritious, containing proteins, carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals that made it an important part of the Egyptian diet. The alcohol content was relatively low, making it safe for daily consumption by people of all ages. Beer was consumed from ceramic cups or bowls, and it was often strained through reed filters to remove some of the solid particles. The beer was typically consumed fresh, as it did not keep well in the hot Egyptian climate. However, some beer was allowed to age for special occasions, developing more complex flavors and higher alcohol content. The social importance of beer in Egyptian society cannot be overstated. It was used as payment for workers, offered to the gods in religious ceremonies, and served at every social gathering, from simple family meals to elaborate banquets. The quality and quantity of beer served reflected the host's wealth and social status. Wine was a more prestigious beverage than beer, primarily consumed by the wealthy and used in religious ceremonies. The production of wine required specialized knowledge and equipment, as well as access to suitable grape varieties and growing conditions. Egyptian wines were highly prized throughout the ancient world and were often exported to other civilizations. The cultivation of grapes for wine production was concentrated in certain regions of Egypt where the climate and soil conditions were most favorable. The Nile Delta and certain oasis regions were particularly well suited for viticulture, and these areas developed reputations for producing the finest wines. The grape harvest was a major event that involved entire communities working together to pick the grapes at exactly the right moment of ripeness. The timing was crucial, as grapes that were picked too early would produce wine that was too acidic, while grapes that were picked too late would produce wine that was too sweet and lacked complexity. The grapes were typically crushed by treading, with workers dancing on the grapes in large vats to extract the juice. This method was gentle enough to avoid crushing the seeds, which could add bitter flavors to the wine. The juice was then collected and transferred to fermentation vessels, where it would be transformed into wine. The fermentation of wine was a more complex process than beer brewing, requiring careful control of temperature and timing. The grape juice was allowed to ferment naturally, with wild yeasts beginning the process of converting the sugars into alcohol. The fermentation process could take several weeks or even months, depending on the desired style of wine. Different types of wine were produced by varying the grape varieties, fermentation techniques, and aging processes. Some wines were consumed young and fresh, while others were aged for years to develop complex flavors and aromas. The finest wines were often stored in sealed jars and buried underground to protect them from temperature fluctuations. The serving of wine was surrounded by elaborate rituals and customs that reflected its prestigious status. Wine was typically served in beautiful ceramic or metal cups, and the act of serving wine to guests was considered an important gesture of hospitality and respect. Wine played an important role in Egyptian religion, being offered to the gods in temple ceremonies and used in various religious rituals. The god Osiris was particularly associated with wine, and the beverage was believed to have magical properties that could connect the drinker with the divine realm. The trade in wine was an important part of the Egyptian economy, with the finest wines being exported to other civilizations in exchange for luxury goods and raw materials. Egyptian wines were particularly prized in the Mediterranean region, where they commanded high prices and were considered symbols of sophistication and wealth. The culinary arts of ancient Egypt were far more sophisticated than many people realize, involving complex techniques for preparing, seasoning, and preserving food that created a cuisine of remarkable diversity and flavor. Egyptian cooks had access to a wide variety of spices, herbs, and seasonings that they used to transform simple ingredients into elaborate dishes worthy of the gods themselves. Salt was perhaps the most important seasoning in Egyptian cuisine, valued not only for its ability to enhance flavor, but also for its crucial role in food preservation. Egyptian salt came from several sources, including deposits left by the evaporation of salt lakes in the desert, and salt extracted from seawater along the Mediterranean coast. The production of salt was a specialized industry that required considerable knowledge and skill. Salt makers had to understand how to extract pure salt from various sources and how to process it to remove impurities that could affect its flavor or preservation qualities. Different types of salt were used for different purposes, with the finest salt reserved for seasoning food and coarser salt used for preservation. The use of salt in food preservation was crucial for maintaining food supplies throughout the year. Meat, fish, and vegetables could all be preserved with salt, allowing families to store food for months without spoilage. The salting process had to be done carefully to ensure that the food was properly preserved without becoming too salty to eat. Honey was another essential ingredient in Egyptian cuisine, serving as both a sweetener and a preservative. Egyptian honey was renowned throughout the ancient world for its quality and flavor, and beekeeping was a well-developed industry that supplied honey for both domestic consumption and export. The production of honey required specialized knowledge of bee behavior and hive management. Egyptian beekeepers used clay hives that could be stacked to create large apiaries. The bees were carefully tended throughout the year, and the honey was harvested at specific times to ensure the best quality and flavor. Honey was used in a wide variety of dishes, from simple sweetened breads to elaborate desserts served at royal banquets. It was also used as a preservative for fruits and other foods, and it was believed to have medicinal properties that could promote health and longevity. Garlic and onions were not only important vegetables, but also crucial seasonings that added flavor and nutritional value to Egyptian dishes. These pungent vegetables were used both fresh and dried, and they were often combined with other seasonings to create complex flavor profiles. The preparation of garlic and onions for seasoning required careful attention to timing and technique. Fresh garlic and onions had to be used quickly before they spoiled, while dried versions could be stored for long periods and used as needed. The intensity of flavor could be controlled by how the vegetables were prepared and cooked. Herbs played an important role in Egyptian cuisine, adding both flavor and medicinal properties to food. Many herbs grew wild along the Nile or were cultivated in kitchen gardens, providing cooks with a wide variety of flavoring options. Coriander was one of the most important herbs in Egyptian cuisine, used both for its seeds and its leaves. The seeds were often ground into powder and used as a spice, while the fresh leaves were used as a garnish and flavoring agent. Coriander was believed to have digestive properties and was often used in dishes that might be difficult to digest. Dill was another popular herb that was used to flavor fish dishes and vegetable preparations. The feathery leaves had a distinctive flavor that complemented the taste of fish, and dill was often used in marinades and sauces. The seeds were also used as a spice and were believed to have medicinal properties. Mint grew abundantly in Egyptian gardens and was used both as a flavoring agent and as a digestive aid. Fresh mint leaves were often added to drinks and salads, while dried mint was used to season cooked dishes. Mint was also used to make herbal teas that were believed to promote health and well-being. Cumin was an important spice that was used to flavor meat dishes and stews. The seeds had a warm, earthy flavor that complemented the taste of beef and lamb, and cumin was often combined with other spices to create complex seasoning blends. The spice was also believed to have medicinal properties and was used to treat various ailments. Fenugreek was another spice that was commonly used in Egyptian cuisine, particularly in dishes that featured legumes and vegetables. The seeds had a slightly bitter flavor that added complexity to dishes, and fenugreek was often used in combination with other spices to create balanced flavor profiles. The art of combining spices and seasonings was a crucial skill that separated good cooks from great ones. Egyptian cooks developed sophisticated understanding of how different flavors worked together and how to balance sweet, salty, sour, and bitter tastes to create harmonious dishes. Cooking techniques in ancient Egypt were surprisingly sophisticated, involving methods that are still used today. Roasting, boiling, stewing, and baking were all common cooking methods, each used for different types of food and different occasions. Roasting was typically done over open fires or in clay ovens, and it was the preferred method for cooking meat and poultry. The meat was often seasoned with herbs and spices before roasting, and it was carefully monitored to ensure even cooking. Different cuts of meat required different roasting techniques and timing. Boiling was used for cooking vegetables, grains, and legumes, as well as for making soups and stews. Large ceramic pots were used for boiling, and the cooking liquid was often seasoned with herbs and spices to add flavor to the food. The timing of boiling was crucial to ensure that food was properly cooked without becoming mushy. Stewing was a popular cooking method that allowed tough cuts of meat to be made tender and flavorful. The meat was typically browned first, then simmered slowly in seasoned liquid until it was tender. Vegetables and other ingredients were often added to create complete meals in a single pot. Baking was used not only for bread, but also for cooking other foods in clay ovens. Fish, vegetables, and even meat could be baked in ovens, often wrapped in leaves or enclosed in clay to retain moisture and flavor. The even heat of the ovens produced food with excellent texture and taste. The presentation of food was also an important aspect of Egyptian culinary arts, particularly for wealthy families and religious ceremonies. Food was often arranged in elaborate patterns and decorated with herbs, flowers, and other garnishes that made it visually appealing as well as delicious. In ancient Egyptian society, food served as much more than mere sustenance. It was a powerful means of social expression, religious devotion, and cultural identity. The elaborate feasts and banquets that characterized Egyptian social life were carefully orchestrated events that demonstrated wealth, status, and sophistication, while reinforcing social bonds and religious beliefs. The planning of a major feast or banquet was a complex undertaking that could take weeks or even months to organize properly. Wealthy Egyptians would spare no expense in creating memorable events that would enhance their reputation and demonstrate their ability to provide lavish hospitality to their guests. The selection of ingredients for a major feast required careful consideration of both quality and symbolism. The finest meats, the freshest fish, the most exotic fruits, and the rarest spices would be procured from throughout Egypt and beyond. Each dish was chosen not only for its taste, but also for its symbolic meaning and its ability to impress the guests. The preparation of food for a major banquet required the coordinated efforts of numerous cooks, servants, and specialists who each had specific roles and responsibilities. The head cook would oversee the entire operation, ensuring that each dish was prepared to perfection and that the timing of the meal was carefully coordinated. Meat dishes were often the centerpiece of Egyptian banquets, with whole roasted animals being presented as symbols of abundance and prosperity. Cattle, sheep, goats, and various types of poultry would be carefully prepared and seasoned with the finest spices and herbs available. The presentation of these dishes was as important as their taste, with elaborate garnishes and decorations that made them visually stunning. Fish dishes were also important components of Egyptian banquets, particularly those featuring large fish from the Nile that had been prepared using traditional techniques passed down through generations. The fish might be stuffed with aromatic herbs and spices, or they might be prepared in elaborate sauces that enhanced their natural flavors. Vegetable dishes at Egyptian banquets were far from simple side dishes. They were elaborate creations that showcased the skill of the cooks and the quality of the ingredients. Vegetables might be stuffed, pickled, or prepared in complex sauces that transformed them into delicacies worthy of the finest tables. Bread at banquets was often specially prepared in elaborate shapes and decorated with seeds, nuts, and other ingredients that made it both beautiful and delicious. Different types of bread might be served throughout the meal, each chosen to complement specific dishes or to mark different phases of the banquet. The beverages served at Egyptian banquets were as carefully chosen as the food. The finest wines and beers would be selected to complement the various dishes, and the serving of drinks was surrounded by elaborate rituals that demonstrated the host's sophistication and wealth. The seating arrangements at Egyptian banquets were carefully planned to reflect social hierarchies and to facilitate appropriate interactions among the guests. The most honored guests would be seated closest to the host, while others would be arranged according to their social status and relationship to the host. The serving of food at banquets was a carefully choreographed performance that involved numerous servants working in coordination to ensure that each guest received the appropriate dishes at the right time. The servants themselves were often specially trained for these occasions and were dressed in fine clothing that reflected the importance of the event. Entertainment was an integral part of Egyptian banquets, with musicians, dancers, and other performers providing amusement for the guests while they dined. The entertainment was carefully chosen to complement the mood of the occasion and to enhance the overall experience of the banquet. Religious ceremonies often accompanied Egyptian banquets, particularly those held to mark important occasions or to honor the gods. Offerings of food and drink would be made to the deities, and prayers and rituals would be performed to ensure divine blessing on the gathering. The cleanup after a major banquet was almost as complex as the preparation, with servants working to clear away the remains of the feast and to restore the dining area to its normal condition. Leftover food was often distributed to servants and the poor, ensuring that nothing was wasted. Seasonal banquets were held throughout the year to mark important agricultural and religious events. The harvest festival was one of the most important of these occasions, celebrating the successful gathering of crops and giving thanks to the gods for their bounty. Wedding banquets were elaborate affairs that could last for several days and involved the entire community in celebration. These events were opportunities for families to demonstrate their wealth and status while celebrating the union of two individuals and the joining of two families. Funeral banquets were held to honor the deceased and to provide comfort to the grieving family. These events were more solemn than other banquets, but were nonetheless elaborate affairs that demonstrated respect for the departed and support for the surviving family members. Royal banquets were the most elaborate. These events were not only social occasions, but also political statements that demonstrated the pharaoh's power and wealth to both domestic and foreign audiences. The influence of Egyptian banquet traditions extended far beyond Egypt itself, with other civilizations adopting Egyptian customs and techniques for their own social gatherings. The reputation of Egyptian hospitality and culinary sophistication spread throughout the ancient world, making Egyptian-style banquets symbols of refinement and culture. Food held profound religious significance in ancient Egyptian culture, serving as a bridge between the mortal and divine realms. The Egyptians believed that the gods required nourishment just as humans did, and the offering of food was one of the most important ways to maintain the cosmic order and ensure divine favor. The daily feeding of the gods was a central ritual in Egyptian temples, performed by priests who had undergone extensive purification to make themselves worthy of serving the divine beings. These offerings were not symbolic gestures, but were believed to provide actual sustenance to the gods, who would consume the spiritual essence of the food while leaving the physical substance behind. The selection of foods for divine offerings required careful consideration of both quality and symbolic meaning. Only the finest ingredients were considered suitable for the gods, and each type of food had specific associations and meanings that made it appropriate for particular deities or occasions. Bread was the most fundamental offering, representing the basic sustenance of life itself. The bread offered to the gods was made from the finest white flour and was often shaped into special forms that had religious significance. Different types of bread were associated with different deities, and the preparation of offering bread was a sacred art that required both skill and spiritual purity. Meat offerings were reserved for the most important ceremonies and were typically made from the finest animals available. Cattle were the most prestigious offerings, followed by sheep, goats, and various types of poultry. The animals had to be perfect specimens, without blemish or defect, as only the best was considered worthy of the gods. The slaughter of animals for religious offerings was a sacred ritual that had to be performed according to strict protocols. The priests who performed these sacrifices were specially trained and purified, and the entire process was surrounded by prayers and ceremonies that ensured the proper spiritual preparation of the offering. Beer and wine were essential components of religious offerings, representing the joy and celebration that the gods brought to human life. The beverages offered to the gods were of the highest quality, often specially brewed or aged for religious purposes. The pouring of libations was an important ritual that accompanied most religious ceremonies. Fruits and vegetables were also important offerings, representing the abundance and fertility that the gods provided to the land. Dates, figs, grapes, and other fruits were commonly offered, along with onions, garlic, and other vegetables that had special religious significance. The presentation of food offerings was as important as the food itself, with elaborate arrangements and decorations that demonstrated respect for the gods and the importance of the occasion. The offerings were placed on special tables and altars that were designed specifically for religious purposes. The consumption of offering food was governed by strict rules and protocols. After the gods had consumed the spiritual essence of the food, the physical remains could be eaten by the priests and other temple personnel. This sharing of divine food was believed to confer blessings and spiritual benefits on those who partook of it. The role of food in Egyptian funerary practices was equally important, as the deceased were believed to require nourishment in the afterlife just as they had in life. The provision of food for the dead was considered a sacred duty that ensured the continued well-being of the deceased in the next world. Tomb paintings and reliefs often depicted elaborate feasts that the deceased would enjoy in the afterlife, showing tables laden with bread, meat, fish, fruits, and vegetables. These images were not merely decorative, but were believed to magically provide actual food for the deceased through the power of artistic representation. Physical food offerings were also placed in tombs to provide immediate sustenance for the deceased during their journey to the afterlife. These offerings included bread, beer, wine, meat, and other foods that had been specially prepared and preserved for the purpose. The preparation of food for burial required special techniques to ensure that it would remain edible in the tomb. Environment. Bread was often baked in special shapes and treated with preservatives, while meat was carefully dried and salted. Beer and wine were sealed in jars that would protect them from contamination. The offering of food to the deceased was not a one-time event, but was expected to continue indefinitely. Family members and priests would regularly bring fresh offerings to tombs, ensuring that the deceased would never lack for nourishment in the afterlife. The Book of the Dead. the collection of spells and instructions that guided the deceased through the afterlife, contained numerous references to food and eating. These texts described the foods that would be available in the afterlife, and provided spells that would ensure the deceased could obtain and enjoy them. The Field of Reeds, the Egyptian paradise, where the righteous dead would spend eternity, was described as a place of abundant food and drink, where the deceased could enjoy all the pleasures of earthly life without suffering or want. This vision of the afterlife as a place of eternal feasting reflected the central importance of food in Egyptian culture. The mummification process itself involved the use of various food-related substances, including honey, wine, and spices that were used to preserve the body and prepare it for the afterlife. These substances were chosen not only for their preservative properties but also for their religious and symbolic significance. The canopic jars that held the preserved organs of the deceased were often accompanied by food offerings that would nourish these vital parts of the person in the afterlife. Each jar was associated with a specific deity who would protect the organs and ensure their proper function in the next world. The weighing of the heart ceremony, one of the most important events in the Egyptian afterlife, took place in a hall, where the deceased would be judged worthy or unworthy of eternal life. Those who passed this test would be admitted to the eternal feast, while those who failed would be devoured by a monstrous creature and cease to exist. The vast expanse of ancient Egypt, stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the cataracts of the Nile, encompassed diverse regions with distinct culinary traditions that reflected local resources, climate conditions, and cultural influences. These regional variations created a rich tapestry of flavors and techniques that contributed to the overall sophistication of Egyptian cuisine. Lower Egypt, the northern region that included the fertile Nile Delta, had access to abundant water and rich alluvial soil that supported intensive agriculture. This region was known for its exceptional vegetables, particularly onions, garlic, and leeks that grew to enormous sizes in the delta's rich soil. The proximity to the Mediterranean also provided access to sea fish and salt that were not available in other parts of Egypt. The cuisine of Lower Egypt was characterized by its use of fresh vegetables and herbs that could be grown year-round in the mild delta climate. Dishes from this region often featured complex combinations of vegetables that were seasoned with herbs and spices to create flavorful and nutritious meals. The Delta region was also famous for its wine production, with vineyards that produced some of the finest wines in the ancient world. The climate and soil conditions in certain parts of the Delta were ideal for grape cultivation, and the wines produced there were highly prized throughout Egypt and beyond. Upper Egypt, the southern region that extended from Memphis to the first cataract at Aswan, had a more arid climate that influenced its culinary traditions. This region was known for its excellent dates, which grew in abundance in the desert oases, and for its sophisticated techniques for preserving food in the hot, dry climate. The cuisine of Upper Egypt made extensive use of dried and preserved foods that could withstand the harsh desert conditions. Techniques for drying meat, fish, and vegetables were highly developed, and these preserved foods formed the basis of many traditional dishes. The quarries and mines of Upper Egypt provided access to unique minerals and salts that were used in food preparation and preservation. Different types of salt from various sources were used for different culinary purposes, and the people of Upper Egypt became experts in the use of these materials. The Nubian regions at the southern border of Egypt had their own distinctive culinary traditions that blended Egyptian techniques with local ingredients and customs. Nubian cuisine was known for its use of exotic spices and its sophisticated techniques for preparing grain-based dishes. The Nubians were skilled traders who had access to spices and other luxury ingredients from deep in Africa. These ingredients were incorporated into their cuisine and were also traded to other parts of Egypt, enriching the overall culinary landscape of the kingdom. The oasis communities scattered throughout the Egyptian deserts developed unique culinary traditions adapted to their isolated environments and limited resources. These communities had to be completely self-sufficient, developing their own sources of food and creating dishes that made the most of available ingredients. Oasis cuisine was characterized by its creative use of dates, which were often the most abundant food source in these desert communities. Dates were used not only as a sweet treat. The border regions of Egypt, where the kingdom met neighboring civilizations, were areas of cultural exchange that influenced culinary traditions. The eastern border with the Levant brought contact with Mesopotamian and Canaanite cooking techniques, while the western border with Libya introduced new ingredients and preparation methods. These border regions often served as testing grounds for new culinary ideas and techniques. Traders and diplomats would bring foreign foods and cooking methods, which would be evaluated and potentially incorporated into Egyptian cuisine. This constant exchange of ideas helped to keep Egyptian cooking dynamic and innovative. The influence of foreign cuisines on Egyptian cooking was particularly evident in the use of spices and seasonings. Many of the spices that became essential to Egyptian cuisine were originally imported from distant lands, and their incorporation into local dishes created new flavor profiles that enriched the culinary tradition. The trade routes that connected Egypt to other civilizations were crucial for the exchange of culinary knowledge and ingredients. Merchants who traveled these routes would bring back new foods and cooking techniques, while Egyptian culinary traditions, Egypt and other kingdoms also facilitated culinary exchange. Royal marriages and diplomatic missions would introduce foreign cooking styles to Egyptian courts, while Egyptian culinary traditions would be adopted by foreign rulers who sought to emulate Egyptian sophistication. The influence of Egyptian cuisine extended far beyond the borders of the kingdom itself. Egyptian cooking techniques and food preservation methods were adopted by other civilizations, and Egyptian trained cooks were highly sought after in foreign courts. The reputation of Egyptian cuisine was so high that it became a symbol of civilization and sophistication throughout the ancient world. Foreign rulers would import Egyptian foods and hire Egyptian cooks as a way of demonstrating their own refinement and cultural awareness. The legacy of Egyptian culinary traditions can be seen in the cooking of many modern Middle Eastern and Mediterranean cultures. Techniques for bread making, food preservation, and the use of spices that were developed in ancient Egypt continue to influence cooking in these regions today. The food system of ancient Egypt was supported by a complex economic structure that managed the production, distribution, and consumption of food throughout the kingdom. This system was essential for maintaining the stability and prosperity of Egyptian civilization and required sophisticated organization and management to function effectively. Agriculture was the foundation of the Egyptian economy, employing the vast majority of the population and generating the wealth that supported all other aspects of society. The annual cycle of flooding, planting, and harvesting determined the rhythm of economic life and required careful coordination to ensure adequate food supplies for the entire population. The ownership of agricultural land was concentrated in the hands of the pharaoh, temples, and wealthy nobles who controlled vast estates worked by farmers and laborers. These landowners were responsible for organizing agricultural production and ensuring that their lands produced sufficient food to meet their obligations to the state and to support their dependents. The management of large agricultural estates required sophisticated knowledge of farming techniques, crop rotation, irrigation, and labor management. Estate managers had to coordinate the work of hundreds or even thousands of workers and ensure that all aspects of agricultural production were properly organized and executed. The taxation system was closely tied to agricultural production, with taxes typically paid in the form of grain and other agricultural products rather than money. Tax collectors would assess the productivity of each farm and determine the appropriate tax burden based on the quality of the land and the size of the harvest. The storage and distribution of grain was a crucial function that required extensive infrastructure and careful management. Large granaries were built throughout Egypt to store the grain that would feed the population during the months between harvests. These facilities had to be designed to protect the grain from moisture, pests, and theft. The transportation of food throughout Egypt was facilitated by the Nile River, which served as a natural highway for moving bulk commodities. Boats and barges were specially designed for carrying grain and other agricultural products, and a complex system of ports and warehouses was developed to handle the loading and unloading of these vessels. The distribution of food to urban populations required sophisticated logistics and organization. Cities and towns had to be supplied with regular shipments of grain, meat, fish, and other foods from rural areas, and this required careful coordination between producers, transporters, and distributors. Markets and trading centers were established throughout Egypt to facilitate the exchange of food and other goods. These markets were carefully regulated to ensure fair prices and quality standards, and market officials were responsible for maintaining order and resolving disputes between buyers and sellers. The pricing of food was influenced by many factors, including the quality of the harvest, the distance from production areas, and the level of demand in different regions. The government sometimes intervened in food markets to prevent excessive price increases that could cause hardship for ordinary citizens. The processing of food into finished products was an important industry that added value to raw agricultural commodities. Mills for grinding grain, breweries for making beer, and bakeries for producing bread were essential businesses that employed skilled workers and generated significant economic activity. The trade in luxury foods and exotic ingredients was a lucrative business that connected Egypt to distant lands and cultures. Merchants who specialized in importing spices, wines, and other high-value foods, could earn substantial profits and often became wealthy and influential members of society. Officials were responsible for inspecting food products, ensuring that weights and measures were accurate, and punishing those who sold adulterated or contaminated food. The employment opportunities created by the food system were diverse and numerous, ranging from farm laborers and fishermen to skilled craftsmen and merchants. The food industry provided livelihoods for a large portion of the Egyptian population and was essential for the overall economic health of the kingdom. The seasonal nature of agricultural production created fluctuations in employment and income that had to be managed carefully. During harvest time, large numbers of workers were needed for short periods, while other times of the year saw reduced demand for agricultural labor. The development of food preservation techniques was driven partly by economic considerations, as preserved foods could be stored for long periods and transported over great distances without spoiling. This allowed for more efficient use of agricultural production and enabled trade in food products between distant regions. The investment in agricultural infrastructure, such as irrigation systems and storage facilities, required substantial capital and long-term planning. These investments were typically made by wealthy landowners or the government and were essential for maintaining and improving agricultural productivity. As our journey through the culinary world of ancient Egypt draws to a close, we find ourselves contemplating the deeper meanings and enduring significance of food in this remarkable civilization. For the Egyptians, food was never merely about satisfying hunger, it was about participating in the eternal cycles of life, death, and renewal that governed all existence. The Egyptian understanding of food was deeply rooted in their observation of the natural world around them. They saw how the annual flooding of the Nile brought new life to the land, how seeds planted in the fertile soil would grow into plants that would feed both humans and animals, and how the harvest would provide sustenance that would carry them through to the next growing season. This cyclical understanding of food production and consumption was reflected in Egyptian religious beliefs and practices. The god Osiris, who was associated with grain and agriculture, was believed to die and be reborn each year, symbolizing the eternal cycle of planting, growth, harvest, and renewal that sustained all life, was seen as a participation in this divine cycle. When Egyptian women ground grain into flour, they were participating in the transformation of raw materials into life-sustaining nourishment. When bakers shaped dough into loaves and baked them in ovens, they were completing a process that connected the earth's bounty to human survival. The sharing of food was understood to create bonds not only between individuals, but also between the human and divine realms. When families gathered to eat together, they were participating in a sacred act that reinforced their connections to each other and to the gods who provided their sustenance. The elaborate feasts and banquets that characterized Egyptian social life were expressions of gratitude for the abundance that the gods had provided. These celebrations were not just displays of wealth and status, but were acknowledgments of the divine generosity that made such abundance possible. The offering of food to the gods was seen as a way of maintaining the cosmic balance that ensured the continued fertility of the land and the prosperity of the people. By giving back to the gods a portion of what they had provided, the Egyptians believed they were ensuring the continuation of the divine favor that sustained their civilization. The provision of food for the deceased was based on the belief that the cycles of life and death were part of a larger pattern of eternal existence. The dead were not gone forever, but had simply moved to a different phase of existence, where they still required nourishment and care from the living. The elaborate tomb paintings that depicted eternal feasts were expressions of hope and faith in the continuation of life beyond death. These images showed the deceased enjoying all the foods they had loved in life, surrounded by family and friends in a paradise where hunger and want were unknown. The preservation of food through drying, salting, and other techniques was seen as a way of conquering time and ensuring that the bounty of the harvest could be enjoyed throughout the year. These preservation methods were not just practical necessities, but were expressions of human ingenuity and divine blessing working together. The cultivation of new varieties of fruits and vegetables, the development of new cooking techniques, and the creation of new dishes were all seen as ways of participating in the ongoing creation of the world. Each innovation was a small contribution to the divine plan that sought to make life more abundant and enjoyable for all. The trade in exotic foods and spices was understood to be part of a larger network of relationships that connected all peoples and all lands. The spices that came from distant countries were not just flavoring agents, but were symbols of the interconnectedness of all creation and the divine plan that brought different peoples together. The teaching of cooking skills and food preparation techniques from one generation to the next was seen as a sacred duty that ensured the continuation of cultural traditions and divine wisdom. The knowledge of how to transform raw ingredients into nourishing and delicious food was considered a precious gift that had to be carefully preserved and passed on. The seasonal celebrations that marked important points in the agricultural calendar were expressions of the Egyptian understanding that human life was intimately connected to the rhythms of the natural world. These festivals celebrated not just the success of particular harvests, but the ongoing miracle of life itself. The development of increasingly sophisticated culinary arts was seen as evidence of human progress and divine favor. The ability to create complex and delicious dishes from simple ingredients was considered a sign of civilization and a reflection of the divine creativity that had brought the world into existence. As we conclude our exploration of ancient Egyptian food culture, we can appreciate the profound wisdom and sophistication of this ancient civilization. Their understanding of food as something sacred, their appreciation for the cycles of nature that sustained all life, and their recognition of the social and spiritual dimensions of eating, all offer valuable insights for our modern world. The gentle lapping of the Nile against its banks, the soft whisper of wind through grain fields, and the distant sounds of daily life in an ancient Egyptian village all remind us of the timeless nature of humanity's relationship with food. The need for nourishment, the pleasure of sharing meals with others, and the gratitude for the abundance that sustains life are experiences that connect us across the millennia to our ancient ancestors. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine yourself sitting at an ancient Egyptian table, sharing bread and beer with people who lived thousands of years ago, but who understood the same fundamental truths about food and life that we are still learning today. Let the wisdom of this ancient civilization nourish your dreams, just as their food nourished their bodies, and their understanding of the sacred nature of eating nourished their souls. The eternal feast continues, as it has for thousands of years, carrying with it the promise of abundance, the joy of sharing, and the deep satisfaction that comes from participating in the great cycles of life that connect all living things. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of this ancient tradition, this timeless celebration of the gifts that sustain and enrich human existence. Epilogue: The Legacy of Ancient Egyptian Cuisine, DYDY. The culinary traditions of ancient Egypt did not disappear with the fall of the pharaohs, but continued to influence the food cultures of the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern regions for centuries to come. Many of the techniques, ingredients, and dishes that we have explored tonight can still be found in modern Egyptian cuisine, testament to the enduring wisdom and sophistication of this ancient civilization. The bread-making techniques, developed by ancient Egyptian bakers, laid the foundation for bread production throughout the Mediterranean world. The use of natural fermentation, the development of different types of ovens, and the creation of various bread shapes and textures all became standard practices that spread far beyond Egypt's borders. Modern Egyptian bread, known as baladi, still bears a strong resemblance to the bread eaten by ancient Egyptians thousands of years ago. The same grains, the same fermentation processes, and many of the same baking techniques continue to be used today, creating a direct link between ancient and modern food traditions. The preservation techniques developed by ancient Egyptians, particularly the methods for drying and salting fish and meat, became standard practices throughout the ancient world and continue to be used today. The knowledge of how to preserve food safely and effectively was one of Egypt's most important contributions to human civilization. The cultivation techniques developed for growing fruits and vegetables in the Nile Valley influenced agricultural practices throughout the Mediterranean region. The use of irrigation, crop rotation, and selective breeding all became standard practices that helped to increase agricultural productivity and food security. The brewing techniques developed by ancient Egyptians for making beer influenced the development of brewing throughout the ancient world. Many of the basic principles of fermentation and flavor development that were discovered by Egyptian brewers are still used by modern brewers today. The spice trade routes that connected ancient Egypt to distant lands helped to spread culinary knowledge and ingredients throughout the known world. The Egyptian appreciation for complex flavors and sophisticated seasoning influenced the development of cuisine. In many other cultures, the social customs surrounding food and dining that were developed in ancient Egypt influenced the development of hospitality and dining etiquette throughout the Mediterranean world. The Egyptian understanding of food as a means of social expression and religious devotion became part of the cultural heritage of many civilizations. The religious significance of food in ancient Egyptian culture influenced the development of food-related rituals and customs in many other religions. The understanding of food as a sacred gift and the practice of offering food to the divine became common elements in many religious traditions. The artistic representations of food in ancient Egyptian tomb paintings and reliefs provide us with invaluable insights into the daily life and cultural values of this ancient civilization. These images continue to inspire and inform our understanding of the role of food in human culture. The medical knowledge that ancient Egyptians developed about the nutritional and healing properties of various foods influenced the development of medicine and nutrition throughout the ancient world. Many of the dietary recommendations made by ancient Egyptian physicians are still considered valid today. The economic systems that ancient Egyptians developed for producing, distributing, and trading food became models for other civilizations and helped to establish the foundations of commercial agriculture and food distribution that we still use. Today, as we reflect on this remarkable legacy, we can appreciate the profound impact that ancient Egyptian food culture has had on human civilization. The innovations, techniques, and wisdom developed by this ancient people continue to nourish and inspire us today, just as they nourished and sustained the people of the Nile Valley thousands of years ago. The gentle rhythm of the Nile continues to flow, carrying with it the memories and traditions of countless generations who found sustenance and meaning in the simple act of sharing food together. The eternal feast continues, connecting us to our past and nourishing our hopes for the future, reminding us that some things truly are timeless and universal in the human experience. Sleep peacefully, knowing that you are part of this ancient tradition, this timeless celebration of the gifts that sustain life and bring people together in gratitude, joy, and shared humanity. The wisdom of ancient Egypt lives on in every meal we share, every bread we break, and every moment of gratitude we feel for the abundance that surrounds us.